Back in February, some of us were able to stand in places that up until that time may only have been names on a page for a lot of us. Places they'd read about, heard about, but until then may well have dwelt in the realm of a long time ago or even once upon a time. And one of those places was Jerusalem, a city whose history stretches back about 4,000 years, a place where even the old city that you can see today is really only the most recent of the Jerusalems to have sat upon those hills. Jerusalem is one of those places that is literally layered in history, so that meters below the modern streets, one can still find the very streets, the very stones upon which Jesus walked. And one of the things that's been unearthed in Jerusalem over the last few years or so is the remains of a building. At this point, they simply refer to it as the large stone structure, but a building which may well prove to be the palace of King David. Constructed 3,000 years ago when David first made Jerusalem the capital of his kingdom. But one of the things to remember about David is that before he was ever a king, before he was ever doing things like conquering strongholds or establishing palaces, he was a shepherd. The youngest of 8 sons, who was left behind to mind the sheep while his oldest brothers went off to do important things like gaining glory in battle and defending the land of the Lord. But eventually, who knows whether this was really a promotion or not, his dad, Jesse, sent David on an errand to take some food and some supplies to his brothers at the front line. And that's where David encounters him. Goliath, the giant of Gath. As these two armies face each other across the valley of Elah, Goliath towers over all of them. At 6 cubits and a span, he could slam dunk a basketball without his feet leaving the ground. He was so enormous that he could plow right through any offensive line in the NFL. He would make Hulk Hogan's arms look like those of Pee Wee Herman. And if you were to look up the word intimidation in a Hebrew dictionary, Goliath's picture would be right beside it. And for 40 days, Goliath's intimidation had done its work on the army of Israel. Day after day, Goliath came out and challenged anyone at all, to come out and fight him one-on-one, man-on-man, to determine who would be the masters of the land. And as Eugene Peterson translates things, when Saul and his troops heard the Philistine challenge, they were terrified and lost all hope. And you know, I don't think there is a more discouraging or demoralizing thought than the idea of losing all hope. If you've got hope, you can face just about anything. And even if you've got only a little bit of hope, you can still face a lot. But if you haven't got any hope, you are in big, big trouble. As somebody once put it, you can live for weeks without food, days without water, minutes without air, but without hope, you really can't live at all. And stealing hope is what giants do. It was true of David's giant, and I bet it's also true of yours. Your giant, your Goliath. And I will bet you dollars to donuts that you have one. In fact, some of you may have more than one. Only in the words of Max Lucado, your Goliath doesn't carry a sword or shield. Instead, he brandishes blades of unemployment or abandonment, abuse or depression. Your giant doesn't parade up and down the hills of Elah. He storms through your office, your bedroom, your classroom. He brings bills you can't pay, grades you can't make, people you can't please, whiskey you can't resist, pornography you can't refuse, a career you can't escape, a past you can't shake, and a future you can't face. And in fact, I'm afraid that by listing some of those things this morning, I may well have played the role of giant myself. You may have thought that by coming here, you might have been able to get away from your giant for a while, but there it is. That too is the nature of giants. David faced one who bellowed his challenges morning and evening. Our giants do the very same thing. Very first thought of the morning. Very last worry at night. And chances are that your giant may well have stalked you for a while. Goliath's family, you see, was an ancient foe of the Israelites. 300 years before David, Joshua had driven their ancestors out of the promised land, but 3 of their cities had survived, and there the Philistines remained: Ashdod, Gaza, the one that appears in the news so often, and Gath. Remember where Goliath was from? Gath. His ancestors were to the Israelites what the Habs and the Bruins are to the Maple Leafs. The soldiers of Saul would have seen Goliath and mumbled, "Not again. My dad fought his dad. My granddad fought his granddad." And I bet you've said the same thing about your giant. Not again. It may be something that just keeps revisiting you. Or it may be something that runs in your family, coming back to haunt you generation after generation. Workaholism, alcoholism, relationship issues, communication issues. Each new generation repeats the patterns of the last, and you wonder, is this ever going to stop? Or maybe you are feeling that intimidation about the future of the church. There is no doubt that there is a battle to be faced here in Canada. Already losses have been suffered. Some of you have experienced that firsthand. And maybe an element of Israel's hopelessness has even crept into your feelings about what you and I can expect here at St. Andrews. Maybe words like inevitable or unavoidable or even unwinnable have begun to claw their way into your vocabulary. You've begun to think that there's just no way to challenge the momentum of a society that is determined to shut Jesus out. Goliath. He blocks the sun and leaves you standing in the shadow of doubt. You've seen him, you've faced him. The crucial question is he all you see? For Saul and the rest of the army, that was precisely the case. All they could see was the giant. And as a result, they lost all hope. But that was not the case with David. It's not that David couldn't see the giant. It's just that David was also able to see something else, or to be more precise, someone else. All the army was able to talk about was Goliath. But when David shows up, he does so with his focus on God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now, the soldiers have never mentioned the Lord. David's brothers haven't mentioned the Lord. Neither is Saul, who's supposed to be the Lord's anointed king. But David takes one step onto the stage, and what he's wondering is how Goliath even has the nerve to show his face. And it's not because of his brothers, and it's not because of the army, and it's not because of who he is, and it's not even because of who Saul is, but simply because of who God is, the living God of Israel. David's the same way with the king himself. No chit-chat about the state of the army, no discussion about the odds, just a God-inspired announcement. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. Even when he's standing before Goliath, David's script doesn't change. When the giant mocks him, David the shepherd replies, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." No one else on the field talks about God, but David essentially talks about no one else but God. And that is the real subplot to this passage. More than just David versus Goliath, this passage is about being God-focused rather than giant-focused. Eugene Peterson calls it having a God-dominated imagination. David is able to see what others can't. And seeing that, he is able to see everything else, including the giant, differently. He sees the giant. That doesn't change. But it's not where his focus is. His focus is on God. Listen carefully again to David's battle cry. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel." Note the plural. Not host, but hosts. Not army, but armies. David's aware that this isn't just an earthly battle, it's a heavenly one. It's not just a battle between human armies, opponents of flesh and blood, but a spiritual battle, and one that God has claimed as his own, for the battle is the Lord's. And so David runs, not away, but straight at the giant. Now, do things like that, and people might well question your sanity. David's brothers certainly didn't want to hear his bold talk, It's hard to say whether they thought he was questioning their bravery or just trying to create a little bloodshed for his own entertainment. I know the presumption and the evil of your heart, Eliab had said to him, for you've come down just to see the battle. Speak about God when everybody else is staring at a giant, and you may well find that they don't respond altogether positively to you either. But don't let that stop you. Don't let it stop you from talking. Don't let it stop you from running, as long as where you're running is straight at that giant. When was the last time you loaded up your sling? When was the last time you picked up a stone to be aimed at your particular giant's head? So often our response to the giant's voice is to hide, to retreat, to give in. Know how often I've felt like doing that myself. We begin listening to those nasty words like inevitable and unavoidable and unchangeable and unwinnable. And we let the giant become our master. But not David. David defies him. David runs at him. And in the end, David lays him low because he knew that he was not in that battle alone. In fact, he knew that it wasn't even his battle in the first place. This was a battle that belonged to God. And so does yours. And so does ours. Whatever giants we face that threaten to become our masters, whatever Goliaths confront us intent on eclipsing our focus on God, those things become God's foes too. And life is a series of battles against them. There simply is no one and done. When David sliced off the giant's head, that wasn't the end of his struggles. In fact, that was just the start. And in reality, in all those subsequent battles, David stumbled as often as he emerged victorious. He stared Goliath down, but he ogled Bathsheba. He defied the Philistine god-mockers in the valley, but he later ran to Goliath's hometown when he was in trouble. He could lead armies, but he struggled to manage his own family. Some wins, some losses. But David's readiness to keep on fighting the battle was another aspect of what made him a man after God's own heart. And we shouldn't be surprised if we ride the same roller coaster. If we alternate between swan dives and belly flops. The heart God loved in David was a checkered heart, one very much like our own. And that's why we need this story, because the giants are still there. Rejection, failure, revenge, remorse. We need to face them, but we do not need to face them alone. And we can do that if we keep our eyes firmly fixed on God. When David did that, giants fell. When he failed to do that, it was often enough David himself who did the falling. Now, some people have pointed out that there is really no miracle in this story. No Red Sea parting, no chariot flaming, no Lazarus walking around. But there is one. And I'm not talking about David's 1,000,000-to-1 shot with his sling. I'm talking about David himself. More than the odds against his slingshot hitting were the odds against him seeing things in that very particular way that he did. But the same God who made a miracle out of David is also ready to make a miracle out of us. And when he does that, we become giant slayers too. Amen.